"They use whips for horses," Helga whispered to her friend, her disbelief a shield against the Texas sun. Only for horses. It was August 1944, and the Texas sun beat down like a hammer on the back of the transport truck. Inside, 40 exhausted German women clung to silence. Dust coated their uniforms, their faces, and their fear. The truck jolted to a stop beside a wooden gate marked Camp Hearn, Texas. When the back doors opened, they squinted against the light, blinking at a landscape that looked nothing like the nightmares they'd been promised. No barbed whips, no shouting guards, only wide fields, fences, and the distant sound of a horse snorting. Helga Voss, a 27-year-old nurse from Hamburg, stepped down first. She braced herself for the blow she was sure would come, the one every prisoner expected. But instead, a young American sergeant tipped his hat and said, "Welcome to Camp Hearn, ma'am. You'll be safe here." His voice wasn't kind exactly, but calm, measured, human. Helga stared at him, unsure if it was a trick. The women behind her exchanged nervous glances. In Germany, propaganda had shown America as a land of cruelty. Posters warned that captured women would be whipped, paraded, or shot. The whispers on the train to the port had been worse. "They say Americans treat us like animals. They say they brand prisoners. They say no one comes back alive." But as the women were led through the camp gate, they saw neat rows of barracks, a flag fluttering above, and the strange sight of American soldiers cleaning stalls for horses. One guard was polishing a saddle. Another leaned against a fence, coiling a leather whip. The sound of it snapping through the air made Helga flinch. Her heart raced. Then the cowboy flicked it lightly, not at a person but at a horse's flank. The animal shifted, calm and obedient. The man patted its neck. "Easy now, Daisy," he said softly. Helga exhaled for the first time in hours. "They use whips for horses," she whispered to Inge, her friend beside her. "Only for horses," Inge murmured, disbelief in her voice. Inside the camp, the guard spoke politely, but with military firmness. "You'll have barracks assigned by tomorrow, meals at 6, noon and 5. You'll work, but you'll be treated fairly." They didn't sneer or laugh. One even offered the women water before they were processed. The gesture, simple as it was, hit harder than kindness should have. That night, as the Texas wind blew through the open barrack windows, Helga lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her brother, still fighting in Europe, still believing the Reich's lies about American barbarism. She thought of the cowboy's whip. In her mind, it changed shape from an instrument of control into something else, something that guided without hurting. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Maybe they use everything differently here, even power." Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance, and the guard's voice carried softly through the dark. "Easy now, Daisy. Easy." In that moment, Helga realized that she was hearing something no German prisoner had been taught to expect: mercy. The first nights in Texas were sleepless. The women lay in their bunks, clutching their thin blankets, listening for the sound of boots or doors crashing open. They had all heard stories of what would happen in American camps: humiliation, beating, starvation. But instead, the guards' footsteps were steady, predictable, and the only thing that broke the silence was the crickets outside and the occasional hoarse snort from the stables. Helga tried not to trust what she saw. She told herself it was an illusion, that the Americans were only pretending to be civilized until they showed their true faces. Yet the next morning, when she and the other women were marched to the mess hall, the smell of hot bread and coffee filled the air. They were served eggs, potatoes, and a slice of bacon. One of the younger women, Renata, began to cry quietly over her tray. "They said we would starve," she whispered. The guards didn't shout or push them. Instead, they stood by the walls eating their own meals, occasionally glancing toward the prisoners, but saying nothing. When one of the women dropped her cup, a guard picked it up and handed it back, his face expressionless. "Careful, ma'am," he said softly. The word ma'am stung more than an insult would have. Helga kept waiting for the cruelty to begin. In Germany, discipline had always come with shouting and fear. Authority meant domination. Yet here, orders were given once and followed without rage. When an American officer explained the camp rules through a translator, his tone was factual, not threatening. "You will work. You will be treated fairly. There will be no violence unless you cause it." The German women exchanged doubtful looks. Inge, the oldest among them, muttered, "No violence. Then where is their control?" Helga didn't answer. She didn't know yet. That afternoon, as the women were assigned to their quarters, Helga looked out the window and saw two guards walking side by side, laughing about something. A baseball game, perhaps. They looked so young, so normal, that it unnerved her. The thought struck her like lightning. They don't hate us. That night she sat by the barrack window, watching the moon rise over the flat Texas horizon. Somewhere in the distance a radio played soft country music. She remembered Berlin, the hunger, the air raids, the noise of collapsing buildings. Here the world felt open, endless, indifferent. Helga wrote her first entry in a small notebook she had hidden in her coat. They are not what we were told. The Americans live by rules, not rage. They command without hate. It confuses me more than cruelty would. As she closed the notebook, a sudden realization struck her. A quiet, frightening one. If the enemy wasn't the monster she had been told to expect, then maybe everything she believed about the war, about Germany, about righteousness itself, was already falling apart. By the second week, the rhythm of life in the Texas camp had become almost predictable. The bugle sounded at dawn, followed by roll call under the wide orange sky. The air smelled faintly of hay and dust. The women lined up outside their barracks in neat rows, still unsure whether they were soldiers or captives. The guards called out their names, checked attendance, and dismissed them to breakfast. No shouting, no threats, just the efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times before. Helga found herself strangely comforted by the routine. There was order but not fear, structure but not cruelty. After breakfast, work assignments began. Some women were sent to the laundry, others to the camp garden or sewing rooms. A few were assigned to the medical hut, where Helga was placed because of her background as a nurse. Her job was to clean instruments, organize supplies, and occasionally assist the camp medic, a tall, quiet man named Corporal Jed. At first they spoke little. He worked with mechanical calm, explaining procedures only when necessary. But over time his silence felt less like distance and more like respect. One morning when Helga efficiently dressed a wound on another prisoner's hand, Jed nodded slightly and said, "You'd make a good nurse anywhere, ma'am." The simple acknowledgement caught her off guard. In Germany, acknowledgement had always come with rank, not respect. She murmured, "Danke," and went back to work, her face flushed. Outside the medical hut, life in the camp carried its strange duality: barbed wire fences, but open skies, armed guards, but easy laughter. The American soldiers were mostly farm boys, engineers and clerks turned soldiers, polite, bored, and homesick. In the afternoons, they sometimes tossed baseballs near the fences. Some of the German women watched with quiet fascination as the guards cheered and teased one another like schoolboys. One day, a guard approached the laundry shed carrying a radio. He placed it by the door and tuned it to a local station playing swing music. The women froze at first, expecting reprimand, but the guard just smiled. "Music helps the work go faster," he said. For the first time, the camp filled with the sound of laughter mixed with rhythm. Inge hummed along, pretending to scrub harder just to hide her smile. That night, Helga wrote in her notebook again, "The days repeat like a clock, but the tick is not made of fear." These Americans, they make discipline feel like kindness. It's frightening to see that strength can look like this. As she blew out the candle beside her bunk, she realized something she hadn't dared admit, even to herself. The walls of the camp didn't make her feel trapped anymore. For the first time in years, she felt safe, under guard, but safe, and that she thought was the most confusing feeling of all. The first time Helga saw the horses, she didn't believe they were part of the camp. They stood in a fenced paddock beyond the supply sheds, sleek brown and gray shapes moving against the gold Texas dust. A few American guards brushed their coats or hauled bales of hay, whistling softly as they worked. Horses had no place in the image she'd built of a prison. Yet here they moved freely, symbols of something larger than she could yet name. One afternoon, when a work detail passed near the stables, a commotion broke out. A chestnut mare stumbled, tangled in its reins, and one of the guards shouted for help. Without thinking, Helga ran forward. "Stop! She's choking herself," she cried in English. The guard, surprised that a prisoner spoke, stepped aside as she approached the frightened animal. Helga's hands moved instinctively, her nurse's calm guiding her more than courage. She loosened the strap, stroked the mare's neck, and whispered in German, "Ruhig, ruhig, schönste calm, calm, brutal." The horse stilled, breathing hard. When Helga stepped back, the guard was staring at her, not with suspicion, but admiration. "You handled her well," he said. His accent marked him as Texan. "Name's Caleb Stone." He offered his hand. Helga hesitated, then took it. Helga Voss. From that day her assignments began to include the stables. It was unusual. Few prisoners worked that closely with the guards, but no one objected. Caleb explained how to feed, brush, and saddle the horses, his movements slow and deliberate. He showed her the whip hanging on the wall, the same one she'd feared when she first arrived. "We don't use this for punishment," he said, coiling the leather carefully. "Only to tell a horse what you want. You don't hurt them. You talk to them." Helga smiled faintly. "In my world, whips never talked." They shouted. He laughed, the sound echoing softly in the quiet stable. "Out here, even the horses won't listen to shouting." As days passed, their lessons became conversations. She told him about her medical work in Hamburg, about the air raids and the hunger. He told her about the ranch he'd grown up on, about his brothers who had gone off to fight. Neither spoke about the war's rights or wrongs, only about people, weather, and home. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Caleb asked, "Do you miss Germany?" Helga looked at the horizon where the sky turned pink and gold. "I miss what it was before," she said quietly. "Before the flags, before the lies." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then he handed her the whip. "Try it," he said. She flicked it lightly, watching it crack harmlessly in the air. The sound startled her, sharp, commanding, but not cruel. Caleb grinned. "See, that's the sound of direction, not domination." That night, Helga wrote in her notebook, the faint smell of hay still on her hands. The Americans use whips differently, not to break but to guide. Perhaps that's what power really is, to command without cruelty. By October 1944, Camp Hearn no longer felt like a prison to Helga. It felt more like a world caught between two wars, quiet, structured, strangely human. The women woke at dawn, worked through the day, and gathered in the evenings to talk or sing softly in German. The guards didn't stop them. Sometimes they even listened from a distance, their silhouettes framed in the warm glow of lantern light. Helga's days were divided between the infirmary and the stables. The horses had become her sanctuary. She liked their quiet patience, their trust earned not by fear, but by rhythm and tone. "You can't lie to a horse," Caleb once told her. "They can smell it when you're scared or mean." She'd smiled, thinking how much that applied to people too. The camp itself seemed to shift as the months passed. The fences were still there, the watchtowers still manned, but the tension that had filled the air at first had faded. The guards and prisoners had learned one another's habits, one another's silences. A kind of peace had settled over the place, unspoken, fragile, but real. On Sundays, the guards sometimes organized small gatherings near the mess hall. They'd play guitar, trade songs, even toss a baseball while the POWs watched. One evening, a group of women joined in, clapping along as a guard strummed an old country tune. Laughter rippled through the camp. It was the first time Helga had heard the sound in years. Later that week, the camp commander permitted supervised recreation time beyond the barracks area. The Texans called it horse therapy. A few prisoners at a time were allowed to ride under the guard's watch. For many, the idea was absurd. Prisoners on horseback. But Caleb insisted. "It helps with the nerves," he told the commander. "Makes them less likely to fight." When Helga first climbed onto the saddle, her hands trembled. The last time she had ridden had been as a child before the war. But as the horse began to move beneath her, steady and sure, she felt a rush of freedom so pure it frightened her. The camp fence blurred in the distance, and for a moment she could almost imagine there was no war at all. From the edge of the corral, Caleb watched. "You're a natural," he called out. "Most people pull too hard on the reins." Helga laughed, wind in her hair. "Maybe I've learned not everything needs force." That night she joined Inge and the others for a small gathering by the barracks. Someone had smuggled in a harmonica. Another brought a half-broken deck of cards. They played quietly, trading stories instead of rations. Inge raised her cup of coffee and said, "We are prisoners, yet somehow freer than before." Helga didn't argue. She knew exactly what her friend meant. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Freedom, she thought, wasn't always about fences. Sometimes it was about the people who refused to use them. She closed her notebook that night with a single line. America fights differently. It wins not just with might, but with mercy. The mail arrived in a canvas bag carried by a jeep from the nearest post office. It was a small event that always sent a tremor through the camp. Most letters were months old, censored or incomplete, but even a few words from home felt like gold to the prisoners. That afternoon, as the camp clerk called out names, Helga almost didn't hear hers. Voss, Helga. She froze. No one from home had written since her capture. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, the paper thin and creased from travel. The handwriting was familiar, her brother Gunther. He was still fighting on the Eastern Front. His words were hurried, desperate. "They tell us Americans are monsters. They say our women suffer in their camps. Be strong. Remember your duty. Endure for Germany." Helga read the letter 3 times, then slowly she folded it shut. Outside, sunlight poured through the barrack window, warm and golden on her hands. The contradiction burned inside her, her brother's fear, his hatred, and the gentle reality surrounding her. That night, after the dinner bell, she sat on her bunk with her notebook open and began to write her reply. She wrote carefully, knowing the letter would be censored, every line read by unseen eyes. Still, she found a way to tell the truth between the lines. "My dear brother, you must not believe everything they tell you. The Americans are not cruel. They are orderly, patient, and strangely kind. We have food, work, even music. They let us ride horses. They treat us as people, not enemies. Perhaps that is why they are winning. Your sister Helga." When she finished, she stared at the words, wondering if he would ever understand. In Germany, to admit such thoughts could be treason. But here, behind barbed wire, she felt freer to think than she ever had in the Reich. The next morning, she slipped the letter into the outgoing mail. As she handed it to the clerk, Caleb happened to walk by. "Letter home?" he asked. She nodded. "To my brother." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we send home." That afternoon, Helga returned to the stables. The chestnut mare was restless, tossing her head. She placed her hand on the animal's neck, calming it with slow strokes. "Easy now," she whispered, more to herself than to the horse. The whip hung untouched on the wall, gleaming in the afternoon sun. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned away. In her mind, she saw her brother's face, cold, exhausted, hardened by years of war, and wondered if mercy could ever reach him. That night she wrote one final note in her journal. "We were told that kindness was weakness, but I have seen it conquer fear. Maybe that is America's greatest secret. It wins without needing to hate." By December 1944, a chill had settled over the Texas plains. The nights grew long, and frost glazed the barbed wire each morning. Inside Camp Hearn, even the guards moved slower, bundled in coats and scarves. For the German women, the season brought memories of home church bells, snow, candles flickering on windowsills. But here, surrounded by dust and fences, Christmas seemed like something from another world. A week before the holiday, the camp commander made an unexpected announcement. "All prisoners," he said through the translator, "will be allowed a Christmas celebration within reason. You may decorate your barracks and sing." Murmurs spread among the women, part disbelief, part wonder. The next day, materials began to appear. Scraps of wood, colored paper, bits of tinsel from the nearby town. Someone found a small cedar tree near the fence line. With the guards' permission, they carried it inside and placed it on a table in the mess hall. It wasn't much, short, uneven, but to them, it was a miracle. Helga and Inge led the preparations. They made ornaments from ration tins and carved stars out of old soap bars. The guards watched, some amused, some quietly moved. Caleb brought in a spool of red ribbon. "From the supply shed," he said with a wink. "Don't tell the sergeant." On Christmas Eve, the camp was transformed. The cedar tree glowed with handmade ornaments, a candle flickering in a tin cup at its base. The women gathered in the mess hall, their voices soft at first, then rising in harmony as they sang Stille Nacht. The sound carried through the cold air, over the fences, into the guards' quarters. Caleb stood outside listening, the brim of his hat tipped low. When the song ended, he walked to the mess hall and tapped on the door. "Permission to join?" he asked, holding something wrapped in brown paper. Helga nodded. He stepped inside, unwrapped the package, and revealed a small phonograph. "From the boys at the gate," he said. "Thought you might like some music." He wound the handle, set the needle down, and a familiar tune filled the room. White Christmas, sung by Bing Crosby. The German women fell silent. Some began to cry. The irony wasn't lost on them. The song of their enemy, sung with such warmth and longing, made them feel closer to home than they had in years. Afterward, Caleb passed around a tray of coffee and biscuits. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. Inge smiled through her tears. "We thought you would hate us." He shook his head. "Ma'am, the war is a long way from this room." Helga sat quietly, watching the flicker of candle light on the cedar branches. For the first time, she saw no difference between the uniforms and the prison dresses. Everyone there was just human. Later that night, as the guards escorted the women back to their barracks, snow began to fall, rare fine flakes drifting down through the Texas air. Helga tilted her head back, letting them melt on her face. Inge whispered, "It feels like home." Helga nodded. "Maybe home isn't a place," she said softly. "Maybe it's the moment someone chooses kindness instead of cruelty." In her journal that night, she wrote, "Christmas in captivity. We were not free, but for one night, we were no longer prisoners. The enemy shared their bread and their music. I will never forget it. It was May 8th, 1945. The Texas sky was bright and cloudless, the wind carrying the scent of hay and dust across the plains. Inside Camp Hearn, the German women worked as usual, cleaning, tending the garden, repairing uniforms. But at midday, a guard hurried across the yard and called out, "All personnel, all prisoners to the mess hall." The women gathered quickly, confusion buzzing through the crowd. Helga sat near the front beside Inge and a few of the younger prisoners. A large wooden radio stood on a table at the front of the room, its dials glowing faintly. The American officer in charge stepped forward. "Berlin has surrendered," he said quietly. "The war in Europe is over." For a moment, no one moved. Then a murmur spread, half disbelief, half shock. Some women gasped, others began to cry. Inge covered her mouth, whispering, "It's finished." Helga just stared at the radio, her thoughts blank. The broadcast began, the familiar crackle of static preceding the voice of a Uet. Proving it. Announcer. "This is VE Day. Victory in Europe. Germany has unconditionally surrendered." The words hung in the air like thunder. Around her, reactions rippled like waves. One woman sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her locket. Another muttered prayers in a trembling voice. A few sat frozen, their expressions hollow. Everything they had believed, everything they had endured, collapsing in a single moment. Inge turned to Helga. "What happens to us now?" she asked. Helga didn't answer. She didn't know. All she could think of was her brother, still somewhere on the Eastern Front, alive, dead, captured. The uncertainty was a weight she could barely carry. After the announcement, the officer nodded to the guards. "You may return to your quarters," he said. "There will be no work detail today." Outside, the camp felt strangely still. The guards spoke quietly among themselves. Even the horses in the stables seemed subdued. Helga walked to the fence and stared out at the open fields. Beyond the wire, the land stretched endlessly, green, alive, free. Caleb found her there. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded. "It's over." He leaned on the fence, silent for a long moment. "When I heard about Pearl Harbor," he said, "I thought I'd never forgive your people. But now," he looked at her and gave a faint smile. "Now I'm just glad it's done." Helga's throat tightened. "Do you think we'll go home soon?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "But home's going to look different for both of us." That night, the camp was quiet. The radio played soft swing music, something light, almost careless. The women lay awake in their bunks, thinking about what waited beyond the ocean. Germany was in ruins. They'd heard cities flattened, families scattered. The thought of returning to that broken world filled them with as much fear as hope. Helga opened her journal one last time that evening. She wrote slowly, carefully, by candlelight. The war is over, but the silence feels heavier than battle. We were enemies once, but here they treated us as humans. I wonder if mercy was the weapon that truly ended the war. When she closed the book, the camp lights flickered out. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone guard hummed White Christmas, the same song that had once made her cry. This time it made her smile. Weeks passed after Germany's surrender, and the mood in Camp Hearn changed in quiet, uncertain ways. The guards no longer barked orders, and the women no longer spoke in whispers. There was no celebration, just a heavy stillness that came when everything one had believed in finally dissolved. Rumors began to spread that some prisoners would soon be sent home. The camp's routines grew looser. Work details were reduced, fences were repaired less often, and the gates stood open longer than before. For the first time, Helga noticed how much the camp resembled a small town. Gardens growing, paths worn smooth, laughter in the evenings. Then one morning, the loudspeaker crackled to life. Transport detail, prepare for departure. Group A will be repatriated within 2 weeks. The words echoed through the barracks like a thunderclap. Inge clutched Helga's arm, her eyes wide. "It's us," she whispered. "We're going home." They spent the next days packing their few belongings. Letters, sketches, small carvings made during long evenings. Helga folded her journal carefully into her bag. It was the only thing she truly wanted to keep. Before departure, the guards held one final assembly. Caleb stood near the gate, hands resting on his belt, watching the women line up. When Helga stepped forward, their eyes met. "Looks like you're finally getting your freedom," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "You gave us more than that, Caleb. You gave us dignity." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a silver button with the Texas star engraved on it. "From my uniform," he said. "For luck. You'll need it where you're going." She blinked back tears. "Thank you." The train ride to the port was long and somber. Through the windows, the women watched endless stretches of farmland roll by. Fields of wheat, small towns, children waving from crossroads. Every scene seemed impossibly peaceful, untouched by the chaos that had destroyed Europe. When they reached the harbor, the sight of the ship waiting for them brought mixed feelings. The hull was painted gray, the deck crowded with soldiers, nurses, and returning servicemen. As they boarded, Helga felt a lump form in her throat. For years she had dreamed of returning home. Now she wasn't sure she wanted to. The voyage across the Atlantic was slow. Some days the sea was calm and blue. Others it pitched violently under gray skies. At night Helga stood on deck, looking back toward the west. Somewhere beyond the horizon was the land where she had learned compassion from her captors and rediscovered her humanity. One evening Inge joined her at the rail. "What will you do when we get home?" she asked. Helga stared into the waves. "I don't know, but I want to tell people what I saw." "That kindness is stronger than hate." Inge nodded slowly. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" "Maybe not," Helga said softly. "But I'll keep telling it anyway." When the ship finally reached Europe, the coastline looked gray and broken. War had turned the cities into skeletons of stone. But as Helga stepped off the gangway, she felt something steady inside her, an understanding that survival wasn't just about endurance, but about learning to forgive. In her coat pocket, she still carried the silver button with the Texas star. She touched it now and whispered to herself, "Some things worth keeping aren't made of steel. They're made of grace." It was 20 years later when Helga returned to Texas. The war had long ended, and she had built a quiet life back in Germany, married, taught at a small school, and raised 2 children who knew peace instead of hunger. But there was something unfinished inside her, a memory that refused to fade. When an invitation came from a veterans association in the United States for former POWs to visit their old camps, she didn't hesitate. When she arrived, Texas felt both familiar and impossibly vast. The same wide skies, the same scent of dry grass carried on the wind. Camp Hearn was gone now, reduced to a few concrete foundations, and a historical marker near a stand of oaks. Cows grazed where the fences had once stood. A local rancher met her at the site. A tall man in his 50s with sun-creased eyes and a broad hat. "You must be Mrs. Voss," he said. "My daddy served here during the war. Said he guarded German prisoners. Said some of them never forgot this place." Helga smiled. "He's right," she said. "We never did." He showed her around the old grounds, pointing out where the mess hall once stood, where the barracks had lined the dusty road. As they walked, she told him stories about the cedar tree they decorated at Christmas, the phonograph that played Bing Crosby, the snow that fell one miraculous night. He listened quietly, then asked, "Did you hate us back then?" She paused before answering. "At first, yes. We were told America would treat us like animals. Instead, you treated us like people." She looked at the horizon, her voice low. "That was harder to bear than cruelty. Kindness makes you face what you were wrong about." They stopped near the open field where the stables used to stand. A few horses grazed there now. The rancher smiled. "You know, when they rebuilt the place, we kept horses here for a while. Some say they're descendants of the same ones your folks used to ride." Helga reached out to stroke one of the horse's manes, her eyes shining. "Then the world really does come full circle," she said softly. As the sun began to set, she stood alone for a while, the warm light painting the land gold. The memories flooded back, the laughter, the fear, the slow transformation that turned enemies into something like neighbors. She remembered Caleb, the guard who had given her his silver button. She still kept it in a small box at home, polished from years of being held. In her final letter to her daughter written during that trip, she explained why she had come back. "I needed to see the place that proved mercy is stronger than vengeance. We were captives, but they never used the whip. The only one they had was for the horses." That difference changed everything. When she boarded her flight home, she looked out over the Texas plains one last time. They were endless, silent, and bathed in orange light. Somewhere beneath them lay the invisible remains of the camp that had once divided two worlds and somehow joined them. As the plane lifted into the evening sky, she whispered to herself, "We thought war showed us humanity's worst, but here I found its best." Back in Germany, Helga's journal remained on her shelf until her death decades later. On the final page, written in fading ink, was a single line. "The fences are gone, but the kindness remains."